in this video to commemorate the death of Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, taken out by the Trump administration. It shows the U.S. Capitol completely exploding.
The words that accompany the video are also something else. The leader wants a vigilant and strong nation. With Ali's army, we will destroy the palace of oppression. There's a report that there's about to be this breakthrough between Iran and the United States in Vienna on the nuclear deal.
There is said to have been progress made in Vienna talks to get the U.S. back in a deal with Iran to rein in its nuclear program. That means sanctions relief and unfrozen funds, and that's got some people worried.
The question for the Biden administration is what constitutes sufficient provocation so that the United States is prepared to withdraw from any discussions with the Iranians. Apparently, the answer is nothing will stop them from caving to Iran.
We should be prepared to not just re-engage with the Iranians as we have, but to negotiate not just a return to the JCPOA, but to have a path forward and a plan for a broader engagement.
Why are we not thinking about how can we add extra sanctions on Iran today after that propaganda video? They are an enemy of the United States. They're an enemy of freedom. They're an enemy of democracy. They're an enemy of Israel. They are housing terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. This should not be a nation that is even close to getting into direct negotiations with the United States and having any sanctions relief whatsoever.
What evidence is there that no matter how much we pony up, Iran will ever be in compliance?
There is no sufficient evidence to support that.
The Islamic Republic of Iran is not what the vast majority of the Iranian people support. It's an oppressive regime. It's a terrorist regime. So the normal rules of engagement, or the rules of propaganda, so to speak, really do not apply with the Iranians because they don't play by any of those rules.
In Israel, police are bracing for more protests and clashes with Palestinians after a night of violence in East Jerusalem that left more than 200 people injured. And it comes after weeks of unrest.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country will not allow extremists to destabilize Jerusalem.
The clashes centered around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sits in part of a complex which is one of Islam's most revered locations, and which also houses the Dome of the Rock, where it is commonly held that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. It is also the holiest site in Judaism, known as the Temple Mount.
Jerusalem is under attack by Hamas. Rockets coming out of Hamas.
These rocket attacks are not just simply on Jewish sites. These include sites that could be hit, including the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, Golgotha, Calvary.
The rockets fell only 4.5 miles west of our ACLJ office in Jerusalem.
Israel has a very strong policy of always responding. You'll never get a situation where Israel will not respond to these attacks.
They want to eradicate Israel off the face of the earth, and so they fire rockets right into this city and other cities. 1 million people are now under rocket fire. Civilized countries have to defend themselves against these terrorist criminals, and that's what Israel is doing. That's what any country would do.
It was the Biden administration that resumed aid to the Palestinian Authority.
We've had virtual peace in the Middle East, whether it was the Abraham Accords, whether it was ISIS, whether it was all these situations. Sure, there were always moments, but there were not rockets being fired. You know why? Because they're not scared anymore that actually things could go wrong for Hamas.
The White House, by their stance and by calling on Israel to not even defend their own nation's capital, the White House is encouraging the violence.
We have filed litigation on U.S. funding of the Palestinian Authority. Because you see what's going on? Believe me, we're paying for it. How about that one? Think about that for a moment. We're paying for it.
1,050 rockets have been launched in Israel since Monday evening, so about the last 38 hours. 1,050 rockets.
Hamas and other terror groups fired more than 1,000 rockets within a day and a half. It's the largest ever rocket fire on South and Central Israel.
Do you believe that we could be heading towards a ground invasion kind of conflict between Israel and Hamas?
There is certainly that risk. The actions to date of the terror regime, the Hamas folks in the Gaza Strip, make clear that they will stop at nothing. Right, they are launching rockets at civilians.
People need to understand what a live rocket can do.
I have been in places on my deployments where we were attacked with rocket fire. It is incredibly frightening, and it is incredibly deadly. deadly.
This is the impact crater of one of them. It sent a fireball throughout this neighborhood, incinerating these cars and firing shrapnel like this into these homes. A woman was killed in that home.
There is a report coming out of CNN that the administration is currently considering releasing another $1 billion of funds to the Iranians. And, you know, they're playing the typical game, calling it a goodwill gesture that'll be used for humanitarian purposes.
They take donor money, hundreds of millions of dollars of each year. They pocket some of that for themselves, and they perpetuate their leadership and the suffering of the Palestinian people.
Every dollar that goes to the Iranians has a significant piece of it that goes either into the pockets of the terrorist theocrats, the Iranian regime, or into the hands of Hezbollah or the Iraqi militias that are Iranian supported, or to places like Hamas and the Houthis, each of whom has genocidal intent with respect to Israel and wants to wipe the United States off the map as well.
Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah Party called for more demonstrations in Jerusalem with this video.
Everybody's calling for de-escalation. The fact of the matter is, this is an escalated event, and it's going to continue to escalate as long as Hamas keeps doing what they are doing. You want de-escalation? Stop shooting the rockets off. That's a good way to de-escalate this.
Biden administration officials insist the border right there, that's not open, that's closed.
The border is closed. We are expelling single adults and families.
It has been 50 days without a briefing on the border from the vice president.
Where is Executive Action Joe? He can stop all of this right now, but he's too scared of his far left flank. He could beef up the border. He could reverse the reversal of policies. And old Joe would do that, but woke Joe can't do that.
My agents and I, we live this day in and day out. As someone who sees this, I can confidently say that President Biden owns this crisis. It is his fault.
The numbers speak for themselves. I mean, if you just look at the empirical data, which is what we do, is, you know, lawyers do this, political scientists do this. You look at the data and you say, well, that was working. This isn't working. How do we get it working again? And one of the things, which of course this administration is just refusing to do, is to put back in place those policies, Andy, that actually worked.
Joe Biden won't agree that anything that President Trump did was right.
People often say that elections have consequences. Well, not only do elections have consequences, Jay, policies have consequences.
Joe Biden said, y'all come, and the cartel said, you better believe we're coming.
We have a Homeland Security Secretary still trying to blame the past administration, but they don't like the policies of the past administration. So even though they worked, they say they were broken because they disagree with them.
There are two bills right now in the United States Senate put forward by Senator Blackburn, Jay, that would very quickly address some of the most egregious things.
What my legislation would do would stop Biden's decision to catch and release these migrants into our communities, and it would reinstate President Trump's Remain in Mexico program.
The root cause is the reversal of Trump-era policies.
Israel is trying to stop this. Gaza is run by Islamic hardliners from Hamas, who have fired nearly 2,000 rockets at Israel this week.
There's not been ceasefires. Sometimes that happens after a couple days, but this is something I think unique.
What we're witnessing is Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, all of the U.S. enemies and Israel's enemies are coordinating their actions, and that is a grave thing.
The Israeli military carried out at least 150 powerful airstrikes against the Gaza Strip. Thousands of Israeli troops remain deployed around the edges of Gaza for a possible invasion.
This is the exact same mistake that the Obama administration made. They said they're going to separate out the nuclear ambitions of Iran from the terrorist activities of Iran and just pretend those terrorist activities aren't happening. The problem with that is, obviously, we need to put sanctions and pressure on Iran. We need to continue to be able to limit their access to dollars because they use those dollars to fund Hamas and Hezbollah. Doesn't help us solve the issue that's in Israel, and it doesn't slow down the rocket attacks coming into Israel.
All of this is going on against a backdrop of the United States having made a decision to provide money to the Palestinians. Why Americans are providing money to the Palestinians while the Palestinians are conducting terror operations against our friend and ally Israel is a real head scratcher for me.
This is a very strong showing from Senate Republicans just a couple of days after this conflict started to have 44 senators sign a letter to the president of this magnitude and says, we call on you to immediately end negotiations with Iran.
We need to make sure that the American leaders aren't just softly supporting what Israel is doing, but making unambiguously clear that the United States fully defends Israel's right to defend itself, and we will continue to support our friend and ally.
Israel is building up forces for a potential invasion of Gaza, escalating the region's worst crisis in years.
This is when Israel needs the U.S., and they need the support, and they want to know the support is coming from the American people as well.